Hey, it's Luke. Before we get started, just a little note. We had a lot of technical problems during this episode, and I think through some pretty sophisticated editing techniques, we were able to insulate you, mostly the viewer, from noticing them. But if there's anything a little off that you see, that's why. It was just like frozen videos. It was just one thing after another. So wanted to mention that. Enjoy. Have you met him, Dudley?
Only during he dialed in. He came to a couple of our like morning markets briefs. The main one was, I think you were there, Luke, during our internship. We had that Q&A, and everyone was asking these like really, kind of deep questions. I was trying to come up with something, really smart to say or whatever. And then after he answered him for like an hour, he's like, guys, come on, like, doesn't anyone want to know like what my favorite ice cream flavor is or something?
Yeah. Exactly. Everyone was trying to look smart. Yeah, I remember that. I also remember, I think I shook his hand and met him. It was at like one of these talking things afterward, like a social after work thing. And he was like going around saying hi to people. That's it.
You remember, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
He was a bit of a funny guy. So he met Dudley as well during one of these events, and apparently, like during his internship. And then I guess like his manager came up afterward and was like, "Oh, I saw you talking to Dudley. Like, that's a good opportunity. Like, what do you say to like, what'd you ask him?" And then said to his boss at the time, he goes, "I asked him what Janet Yellen smells like." And he said the boss got like what? He was so pissed at him, but he was like, asked him something.
It's the root of all evil, of strife
You see this here?
What does Janet Yellen smell like?
Yeah. Because it's like,
because it's why?
Rare opportunity here. So how many people get to
Was he wondering this for a long time? When did this come up? What's the context?
You think that's going to go through, the idea of telling the Federal Reserve they can't pay the banks that interest anymore?
I don't know. I can tell you we had a robust discussion about it yesterday. And we're having a lot of robust discussions. Look, something else I'm pressing for is zeroing out the CFPB. That would save about $7 billion. But actually, the biggest saving there is not even from the direct dollars. It's from ending the regulatory assault that is really hurting job creation. And so there are a lot of Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just pressing on the bank ones in particular because that's of interest to our audience. That would be a big differential in what the banks can be expecting to take in as revenue and as profit for next year. Is that likely, you think, to get done?
I don't know if it's likely. It is certainly possible. What I'll say is, for the history of the Fed, for nearly 100 years, it paid no interest on reserves. And then following the great financial crisis, they put in the policy of paying interest on reserves. It right now costs the Fed used to generate money for the American taxpayer. It's now costing about $100 billion a year. And the way it used to work is, if banks wanted to make money, they had to go invest that money and make loans and take care of it on themselves. I don't see a reason why the taxpayers ought to be paying for it. That's one example that generates $1 trillion.
Look, it was put in place to ensure the stability of the financial system. They didn't want these runs on things. They were trying to do it. If it's unwound quickly, I don't know if it would raise any stability issues, but it would certainly raise profitability issues for the banks if it's done instantaneously.
The first thing on my mind was the host. That was the cringiest part, and the first part, the highest in my mind, was like, oh, well, actually, it was put in place to kind of stop, bank runs and stuff.
Put in place to ensure the stability of the financial system. They didn't want these runs on things
like that. That was cringe. I mean, she's talking about the Federal Reserve System, not necessarily the interest on excess reserves. But besides that, in terms of the proposal, so I think actually we had a little bit of back and forth before this, like before the episode. I think it would save. I think it would save money, and I think there's some commentary from like former like Fed presidents from like the New York, for instance, and Dudley and stuff, saying that like it wouldn't. Same thing with Powell, came out and said it wouldn't. I think it would, and I think we should have that debate. I think it's funny. We could have a robust debate, as Cruz talks about. I'm not sure what those look like, but I'm certainly curious as to what that could mean.
We'll link back to our episode on political theater.
Yeah, the reason why it's in there is because that's like the new way in which they adjust the rate. It's just a mechanism. So I would not agree that we should get rid of it. I think it would be funny. It'd be really interesting. I haven't put enough thought into this as to like what would it look like or what would happen if suddenly you did what Cruz said and just stopped paying interest. I don't know. I don't know what would happen. And maybe that's kind of why like my initial reaction is to like, hey, don't do that until at least I can like see what the other side would be. The other thing that really actually annoyed me, the thought that I had while listening to that, was like it kind of it pissed me off a little bit how like someone from Congress is kind of saying, looking at these different areas as to where to spend money. And I feel like there's some smoke and mirrors going on, saying like it's the Fed's, problem. It's a central bank's issue. They're the ones like losing all this money or whatever, when it's like the spending, like it's Congress. It bothers me that they're sort of pointing to outside of their own issue. Okay, this is...
Come on, Luke. That's what politicians do best.
Yeah, I know. It's just kind of like wishy-washy. Oh, the Fed, they're paying this much money. Let's go blame them. When it's just like, you got the power of the purse. You've, passed laws, and, you've protected this power of the purse to death. And then this deficit is no one's problem and no one's fault other than Congress. I can't say that like clearly enough. It's not the Fed's fault. It's not the president's fault. It's Congress's fault, Cruz. And it's insulting a little bit, I think, to be kind of manipulated in that sense to sort of point in this direction. This whole conversation we're having is falling into the trap, I think, of that, like, we're not somehow, okay, it's not Congress's fault.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, one of the things that struck me, like whenever I was first watching it, was just kind of how flimsy the way that he was speaking about it. Like, Ted Cruz is one of the most gifted speakers of our time, whether like him or hate him, agree or disagree with his politics. He's an extremely gifted speaker, and he was stumbling through this a little bit. He started saying that it's going to save us trillions. All right. We could start to unpack where that trillions coming from. It seems like it's overdone a little bit. But then once he got barely pressed on it, then he tried to pivot to the CFPB, of which he said is going to save $7 billion.
Discussions. Look, something else I'm pressing for is zeroing out the CFPB. That would save about $7 billion, but
we're talking about, less than 1% of his previous, Fed not paying interest on reserves.
No, that's a good point that you bring. Certainly, in terms from like a politician's, tool set of kind of how they talk about things, he was definitely like, she asked him, like, do you think it's going to happen? Probably not.
We can talk about it.
We had a robust discussion. Probably not going to happen. And that's another thing. It kind of makes me feel like it's kind of wishy-washy hand waving. Let's have people like us, talk about something else. And let's get some time on CNBC or whatever and have them talk about some BS so they're not talking about how it's our fault or something.
I see you're not very convinced, Luke.
I mean, all right, but what did? But I do know that there were some words spilled by some former kind of Fed officials.
Yeah.
So like Dudley, and so even Powell came up and said something. So let's see what they said.
Yeah. So exactly. Yeah. So that's the next thing I wanted to talk about. So back to like how I opened talking about Powell's testimony. So one of the senators asked him this question directly. Powell gave a very short answer. I think it's worthwhile to look at that. But then, thereafter, there's some more thoughtful responses that I saw separately.
The payment of interest on reserves has become a central pillar of the Fed's post-crisis monetary policy framework. Since the transition away from the pre-2008 scarcity model, where reserves were tightly managed to influence the federal funds rate, the Fed has relied on an ample reserves regime using administered rates like interest on reserves to maintain control over the short-term rates. As of February 2025, nearly 19% of the $18 trillion in bank assets were effectively loans to the Federal Reserve earning interest. Given this structural shift, how feasible would it be for the Fed to return to a scarcity-based framework where reserves earn little or no interest? And if interest on reserves were eliminated, what would be the impact that would have on the Fed's ability to unwind its balance sheet and manage policy rates?
So we're in an ample reserve framework now, and that's a good thing. That's a result of the global financial crisis and the desire to have lots and lots of liquidity and large liquidity requirements for our largest banks in particular. So that's a good thing, and that enables banks to keep lending through stress and that kind of thing. If you were to want to go back to a scarce reserves, it would be a long and bumpy and volatile road. I wouldn't recommend that we undertake that road. It would not save any money. There's an illusion that it would save money. That is not the case. And it would also not make credit more available. This, in effect, I would say having a lot of liquidity in the system, which is what goes with ample reserves, make sure that banks will be able to continue to lend. So we think it works. And I think unwinding it is a policy choice which could be executed, but it would take years to execute, and it would be challenging and quite volatile.
Thank you.
I don't know, man. Okay. I mean, I can give you sort of my feedback.
Yeah, that one, they got a little more detailed.
Yeah, no, it was a good question. And then we got his position. First off, he said that we could go back to a scarcity model. I think he knows. He probably knows that we can't. It felt. I don't think we can. And I think
like,
there's been,
in theory we could maybe, but yeah,
I don't think we can. I think and you can find like, well, okay. So first things. First off, it was kind of funny to watch him ask the question. He was like reading it, and he could have stumbled it a couple times. It felt like it was a question that one of his staffers kind of wrote up for him.
We're tightly managed to influence the federal funds rate.
Oh, certainly. I mean, it was a very well phrased question.
It was a well phrased question. I mean, the scarcity model, the ample reserves model, all that kind of stuff, and it was right. I mean, it was a good question. It felt as though Powell was trying to exhibit a certain amount of the Fed's credibility and reputation. He's kind of trying to maintain, and part of that is to say we can do anything that we want. We're just like so good, and we're so smart, and we know everything we're doing, that you can't. He couldn't answer that question any other way other than we could go back if we wanted to, but we don't really want to because this is what we really intended the whole time. I mean, the reason why that they had to make that shift into 2008, and they actually had Congress. I think they scared Congress into signing a new bill that gave them the authority to grant interest on overnight reserves. It's because they didn't have any other choice. They couldn't manage it any other way. So to say that we could have gone back, we could go back if we want to, it would just be too difficult, I think is BS, frankly. And then the sale of it, kind of the scarcity model being a good thing, it means that there's the ample reserves model being a good thing because there's a lot of reserves out there and there's a lot of liquidity in there. That definitely flies in the face of sort of what our episode was last week with the Dalio thing. Right. In the sense that, they did it because they had to get rid of, they had to take on all the debt. It's just sort of this natural stage going sort of down the line that's going to end up at, us not being able to pay back our debt. But one of the steps to that is to make money a little bit less valuable. And that's not really a good thing. I guess it's good in the short run. It's kind of something that you had to do in the short run, but in sort of the broader Dalio respect, it's okay, this is just another step towards kind of the, he calls it inevitable. He calls it inevitable. And then finally, and the biggest thing that I had was it would not save any money. I really think that's BS. It would. And I think, I don't know if this is him kind of putting on his lawyer hat. I think he was a lawyer. Or his politics hat. It's don't try to, he's only got a couple minutes to answer questions. So you can't really give any ground. You can't say yes, but. You just have to say no, everything you just said is dumb. Of course it would. okay, I think we should have this out. But like, of course, it would save money. I think it would be disastrous, arguably, in the broader, sense of implementing monetary policy. But would it save money? Sure. It's just like basic NII stuff, net interest income stuff. But we should have that out too. So anyway,
Yeah. So
that's a good clip. That's a good clip. A lot there. I'll say one other thing. It's like I never really considered Powell to be political, kind of until I sort of like heard that, and then I was like, okay, he's a little bit he's a little bit politically savvy, I think, and we just watched it. That's what it looks like. I think.
yeah, no, I mean, he's a lawyer by training. That's how he started his career.
There was some
He was
BS in there, I think, and I think he knows it.
He was also a lobbyist before joining the Fed, so he's definitely well versed in how to answer tricky questions like that. On the point, or like before we touch on the point directly of would it or would it not save money, the answer that he gave, like you said, he doesn't have a lot of time. He needs to say something and say it firmly, right? And he said, okay, we could do this, but it's a bad idea. And I think he gave the points about we need liquidity in the system, and that's a good thing. But then, is it possible mechanically from the Dalio perspective, like from this very broader perspective that you started to outline, Luke? It really does seem kind of inevitable. But let's just say Dalio is incorrect and, whatever, and you can go back. I think technically you could go back. Mechanically speaking, you could implement these things saying that we're going to reduce the reserve requirements. We're not going to pay interest on reserves. We're going to drain reserves out of the system very quickly. The other thing that Powell said that it would cause a lot of volatility. And he didn't say, I think he just didn't have time for it. So that's really the big sticking point for me, because not only would it completely reset the short-term rate control framework, so there would be volatility in the short end directly, you would also have a great deal of volatility in the long end as well, because if the Fed reduces its balance sheet that much, that quickly, all those treasuries on the Fed's balance sheet currently are going to go back into the open market. And we've seen just recently how a big spike occurred in treasury interest rates over Liberation Day. There was talks of, treasury market stability again. It was short-lived, but if something like that were to occur, it would have a really major impact on the treasury market itself. So the Fed would have to just stop paying interest on reserves, as well as drastically reduce their balance sheet, by definition of going back to a reserve scarcity environment. That would require the market to then absorb that, 4 trillion or 3.some trillion of reserves of treasury assets currently on the Fed's balance sheet.
I got sort of hung up on something you said, and it got me thinking. You said that we would have to take away the reserve requirement. I think we would have to put one back in. So the reserve requirement thing.
Sorry,
right?
just real quick. Like, whenever I said that, I meant that the amount of reserves that banks would hold would be orders of magnitude lower. That's kind of what I was trying to say. So there would be a reserve requirement. It would just be a very small fraction of what it is today.
So there used to be this reserve requirement that was part of the mechanism by which they sort of managed the scarcity model. They said you had to hold a certain amount of reserves. And then that was the demand. And it was there somewhat artificially. And then, you would play around with the open markets every day at the Fed in order to get the demand and supply to hit that number that you wanted to hit in interest rates. But you got me thinking, it's like, well, look, what if, if one thing that we like is to have a whole bunch of liquidity, what if we just mandated that the reserve requirement was just 10x what it used to be? What if we just said okay, we're not going to pay you interest anymore, but you have to hold this much liquidity. So we're not going to sell any of these treasuries. You have to hold, right now, they'll have I don't know, banks could have 3%, 4%, 5% of their assets in cash. And now in the past, it used to, like, the way that they came to like the amount of reserves that you had to hold, it was like some small percentage of like all the transaction deposits that were in there. It's some tiny number. Whatever, just like, okay, 2% of your assets have to be reserves. We're not going to pay you any interest on it. Tough. So then at that point, it's not going to go anywhere. So this would be a new regime. It would be like a ample scarcity regime, whereby
So what
like
this would be, sorry, is like doing that would relinquish the Fed's control on short-term interest rates.
well, so but is it if you said that like you knew? Okay, so every bank has like has an account at the Fed, and like you'd be able to know exactly if you just said like 2% or something of all your assets, then you would be able to know exactly how many reserves you should have. So like you already
Of
know what
which
the
today
demand
banks
is
hold
exactly.
between like 10 and 13% or so.
Yeah, whatever it is, and you would know exactly what the demand is. So like theoretically, I've kind of I do realize that I just did like a 180 right just now. Sorry about that. But it's an interesting like kind of theoretical question is if you just mandated the fact that banks have that, and then you try to use the same mechanism you had before, whereby controlling how much reserves are there available to try to hit that interest rate. Theoretically, I don't know. Let's throw that out there. I don't
Yeah,
think.
so the other thing. Oh,
It would totally screw the banks, right? Because right
yeah,
now
that's
they're
the next
getting.
thing I was going to say.
It would totally
'Cause-
screw the banks.
But
'Cause
that's
you're
not a
getting,
good, most people like to hear that, the banks make too much money anyway. But the whole point of what that would do is then they would have this huge hole in revenue of which they would have to take on incremental risk elsewhere to fill that hole.
Yeah, it would be a
So
huge hit to the
really-
banks. Somebody's got to pay, Joe. Somebody's got to pay. It's not going to be the taxpayer,
Yeah.
Joe. Let me put on my politics hat.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so you're defending the big banks, Joe?
That's right.
What?
right.
I mean, that is.
So to
Kinda
fill
to
that
you-
hole, just like you said, it has to come from somewhere. Those holes are material enough to where it would cause a whole reworking of these banks' business models, which is fine, but that can't be done overnight. Is
Yes.
another counterpoint.
Yeah, that's true. The other thing why the Fed would be against it is one of their mandates is to. Joe, by the way, you're frozen. But the other reason why the Fed would be totally against it, one of their mandates, and they would like their missions is like the payment system, implementing monetary policy. But it's also, and this is kind of goes back to my world when I was in supervision, it's to protect, make sure that you have a strong financial system. So the Fed likes it when banks are profitable. The Fed likes it when banks are strong and like safe and sound. One of the things that
safe
one of
and
the things
sound,
that
yes, but profitable.
no, they like.
I mean,
yeah, they like it when they're profitable. Absolutely. So like one of the
but that's not the goal of the Fed, of course, right?
not
It's
directly,
like a byproduct of
not directly, indirectly.
having
I would say
stability.
they indirectly, like one of the ways in which you want to measure it is earnings. That's one of the things that they look at. Like one of the things that examiners will go in there is that they want to make sure that banks have strong earnings. That's what they want. They want to see, because one of the big things, like net income, the bottom line or whatever, feeds into capital. And that's what they want to see. When the bottom line is really low or negative, you start eating away at capital, and that's like super bad. That's like you don't want to see banks go down. You want to see them have good earnings. So I think the biggest pushback would sort of be from the supervision side. And it would be people, kicking and screaming. Michelle Bowman, the new chair, because if you did decide just to not pay them interest anymore and force them, kind of my idea, to just have those reserves there, they would take a huge hit to the bottom line. And supervision folks will be all pissed off because it would be going against what their mission is, which is to make sure that,
Right.
Banks don't fail.
So the whole point of forcing them to have all those extra reserves, presumably, is to increase stability. But if you don't pay them all of a sudden,
Yeah.
it's a
So it
totally
would-
new backdoor to increased instability.
Yeah. So you're getting into, whenever I work at a bank, and there are always levers that you can pull. But anytime you pull one lever, something else goes down. And in this case, they want a lot of
free lunch,
liquidity.
Luke.
No free lunch. So you got liquidity. If you force them to have all these reserves, fine. Liquidity is not a problem. But now potentially capital is a problem because you start eating away at their earnings. So, what do you want? More liquidity. So, these are decisions for policymakers, but I think that's somewhat where it lands. But again, I mean, this comes back.
But the way that you're describing this is really interesting because the question was about returning to a reserve scarcity regime. And I don't think there's any reason why they couldn't. And then how we're talking about it, your idea, like you started, would be like an abundant scarcity regime. Going all the way back to the scarcity, it's like means one thing. And that's what like a lot of the commentators have focused on, and certainly in that interview as well. All right, so I froze, but now you've frozen as well. So one of the major players that talked about this was Bill Dudley, and he was the previous
our former boss. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, he was the president of the New York Fed starting from 2009, I believe, after Tim Geithner got, he was previously the head, and he got tapped by Obama to be Treasury Secretary. So Dudley took over at that point until 2019.
Yeah.
So Bill Dudley, after he resigned in 2019, now he's been a Bloomberg columnist. I think that's really all he does now. Probably some nonprofits or whatever. But he does these opinion pieces, and he kind of comes out swinging on them. Some people speculate he's gunning to be Fed chair eventually, once he gets the right administration in place. But recently, so about 2 weeks after, actually almost 3 weeks after those initial comments were made, then he came out and wrote this little piece. So he was not very indirect here. He titled it, "Ted Cruz Has a Weird Idea About the Fed." In the scarcity regime, it kind of dictates that the asset side also goes away. And that's what Dudley focuses on next. But this is kind of the way that, the way that you and I have discussed it focuses on this. If we were to change it, if you didn't change the asset side.
Okay, fine. Fair enough. We changed the question a bit. Fine.
Well, right. But I mean, I think it's actually a more interesting question because obviously a scarcity regime has been done before. But what we're describing here, this hybrid between the two, has not been done before.
Yeah.
So, your point is that you would still get all the income on the asset side. So you would still, but you're also going to see interest rates increase on treasuries. And you're not going to be increasing the balance sheet further from there because you wouldn't really have any incentive to, but you might be now forced to ensure financial stability.
I'm just thinking about it a little more. I mean, to your point, obviously it would be a very hard pill to swallow if you forced a bunch of banks, basically, as they say correctly, lent to you. You say we're not gonna give you any interest, and then you turn around and put that money into treasuries and earn interest on that. Wow, what a scam! What an incredible government scam that would be. Basically forcing people to lend to you at 0%, and then you go out and invest it at 3%, 5%, whatever. And then you just pocket the difference. So to make it a little bit more palatable, you could maybe get some of the profit and send it back to the banks, to your lenders. How about that?
So really the point is, though, also in doing that, you would be...
Joe, come on. We're just kind of playing here. We're just going to spitballing. Huh?
Yeah,
we're just whiteboarding a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so they get some of the earnings.
So you
said some of the earnings on treasuries, but they keep the liquidity. It's still pure cash, but they're still earning something on it, and the Fed's not going to go negative.
We did this over the 2010s, pretty much. Whenever interest rates were at zero on the front end, the Fed, in doing so, they're kind of losing control of the front end. So then banks would then be incentivized to lend lower and lower because others would start doing that to gain more business share. And I think before you know it, you would have the front end back down to zero again. And then that's where we were over the 2010s. But crucially, that would be the banks deciding what front end interest rates are. And that's kind of the cornerstone of the Fed's one of the primary tools of their implementation of monetary policy is controlling that interest rate. And they just wouldn't be able to anymore at that point because you're not in a scarcity regime. Because, like we're saying, if you hold that asset side, the bank or the Fed couldn't buy and sell Treasury bills every day to control that anymore.
You don't think so?
Well, there would just be too much capital in the system. That's the whole point.
But
Banks
I mean, it's
would
just
have to
numbers.
keep lending it somewhere.
If you forced banks to send, you said you have to, you have to hit a certain number of reserves, and you controlled how many reserves there were. Why couldn't you hit a number? Why couldn't you hit any interest rate you wanted?
Well, the banks would be.
It doesn't matter how big it is. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with. I don't know what the reserve number was before 2008. It was like 100 billion or something, and then
like even less. It was like
whatever it is. But
less.
So what if you're dealing with 100 billion versus 3.5 trillion? What difference does it make? We're just talking about number of zeros here. The fundamental
100 billion. That's back to a scarcity regime. That would
right. But you're saying that we
down
couldn't
the
even
asset side.
Yeah, but you're saying that we couldn't even influence the short-term rate number, like the overnight, the Fed funds rate. We would go back to actually having the Fed funds like effective rate actually be the one you're looking at, and not the interest on overnight reserves number. Why? I'm not. And like
no. That's a great question
now. But it's like if you knew exactly what the demand was, it doesn't matter how big it was. It doesn't matter if it was 100 billion or 3.5 trillion. You knew exactly what that was because you set with that number in the reserve requirement. And then B, you had full control over the supply of reserves. And again, that would be the interest on that would be the open markets thing. Sure, the markets folk might be a little bit upset because they'd be a lot more busy. Because they'd be, having to, get into the open market and adjust the supply. But
but that's the key point. If there's that many reserves out there, you can't control the interest rate anymore by buying and selling a few billion every day. You already have that 3 trillion there.
So you would have to, you could, I guess, theoretically do it if the Treasury market was so deep that you could go out there and sell like 100 billion in a day. But is that the problem? It's just like the amount of back in the 100 billion, the scarcity days, you could you could kind of fidget around in the corner of the market.
But
if you went out,
the banks,
the Fed sold 100 billion. Yes.
So we're saying you have to hold that much anyway, no matter what.
Yeah.
If you go and buy and sell a little more on top, it's not going to affect anything.
So make it more. I guess the delta here that we're getting kind of come up with is
that's the point, is though
it's just the number of zeros.
Control that again. You would have to pull that asset side down. You would have to sell it by that amount to make those open market operations have any impact. So then,
just make the open market operations bigger.
That's what I mean. To make them big enough to be meaningful.
Yes.
That means you're back at a scarcity regime.
No, you would go back. All right. Well, I think we're maybe leave it.
This is all kind of untread territory. I feel mostly confident in what I'm saying, but it's still
I'm not confident at all. I'm putting forward the theoretical question of the dynamic, not the dynamic, but the mechanism by which they're able to control interest rate had to do with lining up supply and demand. And what I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter how big it is. That mechanism should still theoretically work, whether you're dealing with 100 billion or you're dealing with 3.5 trillion. You can change around the demand and the supply side so that you can hit that short-term rate. The problem that you raised that I didn't think of was the fact that yes, if you want the amount in the open market that you would have to buy and sell every day would be 10x. It would be, huge relative to what you were doing in pre-2008. Now, whether or not that would cause the problem about the Fed going into the market and suddenly buying 300 billion of treasuries or going out there and selling 300 billion of whatever in order to influence the supply number, that's a fair point. Because then you could introduce a whole lot of volatility. Because then you would have
it's not even 300 billion. It would be the order of trillions. And
you
so
think so?
Also, not only, well, just mechanically with that supply and demand, if you want to move it,
how much did it fluctuate? How much did it fluctuate before 2000 on a percentage basis in the 2008 era? Do you know? There's no reason you should know this.
Interest rates? What? No,
the open markets,
daily level of reserves.
Yeah, that or the other side, the
open
treasuries.
market operations again, like where
this predates both of us.
Like tens of billions.
Tens of billions. So like 10%.
Like the daily reserve levels, banks all managed effectively towards zero every day. So the amount that you had to buy and sell were on the order of billions to get there. Now we're talking about
by the Fed or each bank.
By the Fed.
By the Fed was billions out of.
So yeah, just because the size of that interbank market was on the order of billions and still is on the order of billions.
Yeah,
that was the market that dictated short-term rates. If we're saying the Fed can't pay interest anymore, like you also pointed out, now it's going to be decided by that Fed funds rate interbank lending market again.
Mm-hmm.
But to have any control over it, you would have to operate in a size that's at least commensurate to some level with the overall size of that market now.
Sure.
So you would have to transact on the order of, like $1 trillion or more. And obviously, so the Fed. So, I mean, like that's what I just said. So to have an impact, you would have to operate on.
I'm not totally convinced. Okay.
So,
I'm not
but
totally
like
convinced,
it's two problems.
Okay. That's a problem. I agree.
If you were
it's a problem.
transacting in that size, it's volatility of the Treasury market in itself
by the Fed, by the central bank. The central bank is going to be causing all the volatility because they're going to be buying and selling in some huge. Okay. That would be a great question to the markets group. I would be really curious to see, like, if we just mandated every bank has to hold the current amount of reserves that they have in there, and we wanted to go back to a scarcity model, and we wanted to influence interest rates, how much on a daily basis, on average, would we be buying and selling in the open market? And they could come back and they might say 100 billion. I would venture to guess it would be like 300 billion, just like out of just plucking a number out of the air. You're saying it's $1 trillion. I would be really curious to see what a group of like 3 economists or whatever in the markets group would come up with.
Let's start with the supposed savings. For the Fed, reserves are created when it increases its holding of interest-earning assets such as Treasury securities. If it stopped paying interest, banks would reduce their reserves to the bare minimum needed to execute payments into and out of their accounts at the Fed. So up front, he takes that assumption as a given, whereas we've been saying, well, no, if you just still told them you have to keep this amount, we're just not going to pay you anymore.
Yeah, you reintroduce the reserve requirement.
Mm-hmm. And he says, this in turn would require the Fed to sell off assets to restore the balance sheet between the demand and supply of reserves. Otherwise, short-term interest rates would plummet to zero. And that's kind of my point of the Fed would just be giving up its control of that front-end interest rate. He says the reduction in the Fed's balance sheet in turn would reduce its interest income. With both sides of its balance sheet shrinking by the same amount, its profits and remittances to the U.S. Treasury would not materially change.
I mean, they would go down, though.
Well, I mean, like we're talking order of magnitude, like the magnitude that you're going to be save on not paying banks interest on reserves is going to be offset by the amount that you have to reduce the balance sheet on your assets.
So like if you dropped it by like $1 trillion, you're not saving whatever the overnight reserve rate is. What is it, 4.4 or something? You're not saving 4.4 on $1 trillion. You're saving the delta between the 4.4 and the trillion, whatever you're earning on the asset side, which is going to be much less. It's going to be maybe an interest like 1%. I don't know what the maybe you would know this, but like on average, how much does the Fed earn on its asset side from treasuries on average?
I don't know the number. I would have to assume somewhere.
I'd be really curious.
The threes area.
The threes area. That's kind of what I was assuming too.
I mean, they bought trillions over 2020 whenever interest rates were brought down to zero.
Nothing, yeah.
So there's like a couple of these long end bonds out there that are paying coupons of like
3%.
1%. No, like
Really?
1%. Yeah.
For what? 20 years?
30
30
years.
years? Shut
So
up.
now, like
Really?
those bonds, I mean, just mechanically. So interest rates were taken to zero at the time. If you
Yeah,
look,
but they
like
thought it would-
the 10-year
okay.
Treasury yield fell to as low as 50 basis points
The
in
10-year?
the worst heat. Yeah.
Wow. I never really appreciated that.
Now it didn't
Oh my
stay there, but I
God.
remember seeing it hit 50 basis points. That was kind of like everyone on the floor is like, what is going on? I think the entire market saw that at that moment. It's like, okay, wait a minute. We're almost at zero on the 10-year US Treasury yield. But thereafter, it was in the 1%. And then, the long bond, the 30-year yield was in the 1%
Janet
area as
Yellen
well.
must have just been licking her lips, just been like, oh my God, lock that in.
Yeah, no, and I mean, so now the so they issued on that, just as they would normally, and so now there's certain long end Treasury bonds out there that are paying 1% coupon or whatever it may be that the Fed probably paid at par for because that was the market rate, but now rates are at almost 5% on the long end. Those are it's like the Fed has lost probably like close to half the value of that bond.
Yeah. I mean, so there are two things that the Fed could do if it wanted to save money. One is lower interest rates because like the Fed is forever like liability sensitive, like all of it. So what that mean? That's like a banking term. It just means that just means that if you're liability sensitive, it means if rates go down, you earn money. If rates go up, you lose money. And then conversely, asset sensitive is the opposite. If rates go up, you earn more money. This is a kind of important topic in the field of interest rate risk, and like all banks of Treasury will monitor this. The Fed is like forever, liability sensitive. So if rates go down, which it has control over, because it's borrowing, it's all like super short term stuff. It's just like this overnight cash. That when rates go down, it's going to earn more money because everything reprices on the liability side immediately. So if the Fed wanted to, get back up to earning a profit, it could just lower interest rates, and or it could save some money. I still maintain that if it shrank the balance sheet, because on the one hand you're losing assets that are earning you 3%, but on the liability side you're losing liabilities that you have to pay at 4.5%. So you would be able to shrink the negative net interest income figure a little bit.
So yes, totally agreed. It would improve the Fed's net fiscal situation, its net cash flows,
like what they're complaining
at the
about.
expense of the taxpayer paying higher rates, which is kind of where we started here in the first place. We want to help the taxpayer by.
Yeah, true. If you lost, yeah, exactly. I mean, if you lower demand for the treasuries by trying to sell them back into the market, yields go up. Right. That's a fair point. Yeah. Another good point, Joe. Really on
Checkmate, huh?
target today. Yeah. Shit. Oh.
No, this is a. Again, like I said, I was not that I thought
This is
wouldn't be a good
this is
topic,
definitely a more technical one. I don't know how you're going to cut this. People like we work with would be able to, I think, follow along pretty well.
Honestly, at this point, maybe this isn't going to be a home run on views, but like to me, I think this is just a valuable conversation that we're having.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Put it into a video, and like we can, look back on it years from now.
All right. It's been another episode of the Root of All Evil podcast, still a podcast. I don't know if you want to kind of splice in what we talked about before on the Riverside. I thought that was kind of interesting, but whatever you want to do.
Try.
And I'm Luke.
Joe.
And I'll see you next week.
See you next time.